The flames rose 40 feet into the frozen sky, painting the snowdrifts orange and casting dancing shadows across the granite ridgeline, where Catherine Wade lay motionless beneath her ghillie suit. She watched through her binoculars as 14 months of survival burned to ash. 3 weeks of ammunition, 6 weeks of rations, her maps, her backup radio, her only photograph of home, gone. The enemy soldiers stood in a loose circle around the blazing supply shack, their breath rising in white plumes that merged with the smoke. 8 men, AK-pattern rifles slung across their chests, heavy winter parkas that made them look like bears against the firelight. They were laughing, actually laughing. One of them raised his rifle and fired 3 celebratory rounds into the air. The muzzle flashed briefly, outshining the inferno. Catherine counted them, memorized their positions, noted the sergeant standing slightly apart from the others, arms crossed, watching the flames with a satisfied expression of a man who believed he had won. She had killed a scout 3 days ago, 300 yards through heavy snowfall. The man had been careless, silhouetted against the ridgeline at dawn, and Catherine put a single 168-grain round through his chest before he ever knew she existed. Now his unit had found her supply cache and burned it to the ground in retaliation. They thought this would break her. They thought a woman alone in these mountains, stripped of her supplies, would have no choice but to retreat to friendly lines 40 miles south. They thought they had won. If that opening hooked you, trust me, this story only gets more intense. Subscribe now for more real stories of courage, and hit that notification bell. Now, let me take you back to where Catherine Wade learned that the cold was her ally, and the snow would remember nothing of what came next. Catherine's call sign was Frost, not because of the white streaks in her hair that had appeared sometime during her 9th month of deployment, though her spotter, before he'd been medevaced with shattered femur, had joked about that. No, they called her Frost because of the way her heart rate dropped when she looked through a scope. 52 beats per minute at rest. 38 when she pulled the trigger. The military psychologist had a term for it. Controlled parasympathetic response. The ability to manually override the body's fight or flight instinct and enter a state of almost supernatural calm. Most snipers train for years to achieve it. Catherine had been doing it since she was 12 years old, lying on her belly in the Montana dirt, while her father, a man who had seen things in Korea that he never discussed, taught her to shoot. Breathing is lying, he used to say, his voice flat and emotionless as he adjusted her grip on the old Remington 700. Your body lies to you, tells you to rush, tells you to flinch, tells you to be afraid. You have to teach it the truth. Slow is smooth, smooth is fast, and the bullet doesn't care about your feelings. She was 31 now, or maybe 32. The months blurred together in these mountains, and she had stopped keeping careful track somewhere around kill number 23. What she did track, with obsessive precision, was her ammunition count, her barrel wear, the drift patterns of the wind through this particular valley at different times of day. And now her ammunition count had just dropped from 247 rounds to 12. 12 rounds. 12 lives she could take before her rifle became nothing more than an expensive club. The fire was dying down now. The supply shack reduced to a skeleton of charred timber collapsing in on itself. The enemy soldiers had stopped laughing and were beginning to organize themselves for the return march to their camp. Catherine watched them form up into a loose patrol formation. 2 men on point, 4 in the center, 2 trailing as rear security. Military discipline. Professional soldiers. Good. Professionals were predictable. They followed training. They made assumptions based on doctrine. They assumed she would run. Catherine didn't move. The temperature had dropped to -8 Celsius, and the snow was beginning to fall again. Fat, heavy flakes that would cover any tracks within the hour. Her thermal blanket was wrapped tight around her shoulders beneath the ghillie suit, trapping what body heat she could manage. She had 4 energy bars in her chest rig. 2 bottles of water that would freeze solid if she didn't keep them against her skin. A backup knife, a pistol with 2 magazines, and 12 rounds for her rifle. She lay there for another 47 minutes, counting down the seconds in her head, listening to the crunch of boots fade into the forest below. The fire collapsed entirely, sending up a final plume of sparks that swirled upward and vanished into the darkness. Then there was only the sound of wind and the soft hiss of falling snow. Catherine exhaled slowly, a 4-count breath that steamed in the frozen air, and began to move. 2 miles north, buried beneath a rock overhang that had once served as the entrance to an abandoned mining tunnel, she had cached emergency supplies 6 weeks ago. Standard operating procedure for any loan operator. Never keep all your eggs in one basket. The cache contained 12 additional rounds of match-grade .308, another thermal blanket, a week's worth of dehydrated rations, and a detailed topographic map of the surrounding terrain. 12 plus 12, 24 rounds. 24 chances to kill the men who thought they had defeated her. The snow came down harder as Catherine picked her way along the ridgeline, staying below the crest where her silhouette would be visible against the sky. The moon was hidden behind thick cloud cover, and she moved by memory and instinct, her boots finding purchase on rocks she had traversed dozens of times before. Every step was deliberate, every movement economical. Sound discipline was everything in this environment. A single misplaced footfall could send loose scree tumbling down the slope, announcing her position to anyone within half a mile. She had been walking for approximately 90 minutes when she reached the mining tunnel. The entrance was exactly as she had left it, a narrow gap between two massive granite boulders, partially obscured by a drift of accumulated snow. Catherine dropped to her knees and began digging with her gloved hands, clearing away the fresh powder until she could squeeze through the opening. Inside, the temperature was actually warmer, perhaps -4 Celsius instead of -12. Still cold enough to kill an unprepared person overnight, but manageable with proper gear. She found her cache by feeling the absolute darkness, a waterproof bag buried beneath a layer of loose stones. 12 rounds, 1 thermal blanket, 5 packets of dehydrated beef stroganoff, 3 chemical light sticks, water purification tablets. Catherine cracked one of the light sticks and shook it until it began to glow a faint green. In the dim illumination, she could see her breath fogging in front of her face. She could see the walls of the tunnel stretching back into darkness. She could see the rifle in her hands, a bolt-action precision weapon chambered in .308 Winchester, the same caliber her father had taught her to shoot with 20 years ago. Different rifle, same philosophy. She settled against the tunnel wall, wrapped both thermal blankets around her shoulders, and began to clean her weapon. The ritual was meditative. Bolt removed, chamber inspected, bore swabbed with cleaning patches until they came out white. Each component examined for wear, for damage, for any microscopic imperfection that might cause a round to fly 3 inches off target at 400 yards. 3 inches at 400 yards was the difference between a kill and a miss. A miss would get her killed. As she worked, she thought about the men who had burned her supplies. 8 of them now, down from 9 before she had killed their scout. She had been observing their camp for 6 days before that first engagement, cataloging their patterns, memorizing their faces through her binoculars. The sergeant was named Victor Clav. She had heard the others call him that during one of her nighttime reconnaissance missions, crawling to within 200 yards of their perimeter to gather intelligence. He was the leader, the decision-maker, the one who had ordered the retaliatory burning of her supply shack. He thought like a soldier. He assumed his enemy thought like a soldier too. Catherine didn't think like a soldier. She thought like a hunter. Her father had taken her deer hunting every autumn from the age of 8 until she left for basic training at 18. He never talked much during those trips. He never talked much at all, but he had taught her everything she needed to know through demonstration and repetition. How to read tracks in fresh snow. How to predict where an animal would move based on terrain and weather. How to wait for hours, for days, until the perfect shot presented itself. Never chase, he told her once, his voice barely above a whisper as they lay in a deer blind watching a 12-point buck browse through an oak grove 400 yards away. Chasing is for amateurs. Professionals let the prey come to them. You control the environment. You create the conditions. And then you wait. They had waited another 3 hours that morning. The buck eventually wandered into a clearing at 220 yards, perfectly broadside, and Catherine had dropped him with a single shot through the heart. Her father hadn't said anything. He just nodded once, a small, tight movement that meant approval, and they had spent the next 4 hours field dressing the carcass and dragging it back to his truck. That was the longest conversation they ever had. Now she applied those same principles to hunting men. The psychology was different. Humans were more paranoid, more unpredictable, more capable of learning from mistakes, but the fundamentals remained the same. Control the environment, create the conditions. Wait Victor Klov had made his first mistake by burning her supplies. He assumed that destruction would force her to retreat. He didn't understand that she had redundancies, caches, backup plans layered upon backup plans. His second mistake was celebrating. Catherine had watched his men fire those rounds into the air, wasting ammunition in a display of machismo that served no tactical purpose. They were overconfident. They believed the threat had been neutralized. Overconfidence created openings. She finished cleaning her rifle at approximately 0130 hours. The bolt slid home with a smooth click. The scope was secure in its mount. 24 rounds of match-grade 168-grain boat-tail hollow-point ammunition manufactured at the Lake City Army Ammunition Plant, lot number 4827. She knew the ballistic profile of every round by heart. Muzzle velocity 2,700 feet per second. Effective range 800 yards in ideal conditions. Predictable drop and drift curves that she could calculate in her head faster than most people could work a smartphone. She ate 2 of her energy bars, 480 calories that would sustain her through the night, and drank water from a bottle she had kept tucked against her stomach to prevent freezing. Then she wrapped herself in the thermal blankets and closed her eyes. Not to sleep. She rarely slept anymore, not in the traditional sense. Instead, she entered a state of semi-conscious rest that allowed her body to recover while keeping her mind alert to any change in the environment. 14 months of lone operation had taught her this skill out of necessity. True sleep was a luxury she couldn't afford. In the darkness, she rehearsed a shot. This was a technique her sniper school instructor had taught her. Visualization as a tool for precision. The brain couldn't distinguish between a vividly imagined action and a real one. The neural pathways fired the same way. The muscle memory encoded the same patterns. If you rehearse a shot 100 times in your mind, your body would perform it automatically when the moment came. She visualized the valley floor, the open ground between the tree line and the frozen creek bed, the patrol route that Victor's men had used 3 times in the past week, always approaching from the southeast, always at roughly the same time, between 0630 and 0700 hours. She visualized herself on the granite outcropping that dominated the northern ridge for 115 yards from the valley floor, a stable shooting position with good cover and multiple egress routes. Wind would be coming from the northeast at that hour, probably 15 to 20 miles per hour based on the patterns she had observed. Temperature would still be below freezing, which affected bullet trajectory in predictable ways. She visualized Victor Klov walking point. He always walked point, a sergeant leading from the front, demonstrating his courage to his men. Predictable, exploitable. She visualized the crosshairs settling on his center mass. The 2 inches right of his sternum where his heart pumped blood at 68 beats per minute. She visualized her breathing pattern. 4-count inhale, 7-count hold, 8-count exhale, timing the trigger pull to the natural respiratory pause between exhale and inhale. She visualized the rifle's recoil, barely noticeable with proper positioning. The spent casing ejecting to the right. The sound of the shot arriving at the target a fraction of a second after the bullet, because the projectile will be traveling faster than sound at that range. She visualized Victor falling, the confusion of his men, the panic that would follow when they realized the shot had come from 400 yards away, from an angle they couldn't identify, from a shooter they couldn't see. 1 shot, 1 kill, psychological devastation. That was the plan. But plans required adaptation, and Catherine spent the next 3 hours working through contingencies in her mind. What if Victor didn't walk point? What if the patrol took a different route? What if the wind shifted unexpectedly? What if she was spotted before she could take the shot? Each scenario had a response. Each response had backup options. Each backup option had been war-gamed until it felt as natural as breathing. At 0400 hours, she opened her eyes. The green glow of the chemical light stick had faded to almost nothing. She had been lying in near total darkness for the past hour. Catherine reached into her chest rig, found a fresh light stick, and cracked it. The tunnel filled with pale green luminescence. Time to move. She packed her gear with methodical precision. Thermal blankets folded and stowed, empty water bottles refilled from a small trickle of snowmelt at the back of the tunnel, rifle slung across her chest with a scope cap secure to prevent fogging. The temperature outside would be at its lowest now, probably minus 15 Celsius. The wind would be picking up as the cold air masses shifted with the approaching dawn. Perfect conditions. She squeezed to the tunnel entrance and emerged into a world of absolute darkness and swirling snow. The storm from earlier had intensified. Visibility was perhaps 50 yards, maybe less than the heaviest gusts. Catherine smiled grimly. The weather would mask her movement. It would also make the shot more difficult, but she had accounted for that in her calculations. The route to the northern ridge was approximately 1.3 miles of difficult terrain. Frozen scree fields, dense stands of snow-covered pine, and 2 steep gullies that required careful navigation. Catherine covered the distance in 93 minutes, moving slowly enough to avoid sweating. Sweat was deadly in these temperatures. It soaked into clothing and then froze, drawing heat away from the body at catastrophic rate. She reached the granite outcropping at 0547 hours. The position was exactly as she remembered it, a natural bowl in a rock face, protected from the wind on 3 sides, with a narrow gap between 2 boulders that provided a clear line of sight to the valley floor below. Catherine settled into the bowl and began preparing her firing position. First, she cleared the snow from a flat section of rock where she would lie. Then she positioned her pack as a supplementary rest, creating a stable platform for the rifle's forestock. She checked the scope one final time. No fogging, no ice crystals on the lens, the reticle perfectly centered, and then she began the process of zeroing herself. Body position at a 45-degree angle to the target zone. Legs spread for stability. Toes pointed outward. Elbows planted firmly on the rock surface. Cheek welded to the stock in exactly the same position she had used for 100,000 practice shots over the past 20 years. Now came the hardest part, waiting. The snow continued to fall as the sky began to lighten almost imperceptibly. Minute by minute, the absolute darkness faded to a deep gray, then to a lighter gray, then to the pale white glow that passed for dawn in these mountains. Catherine watched the valley floor through her scope, tracking the gradual emergence of terrain features from the gloom. The frozen creek bed, the tree line, the open ground where a trail had been worn into the snow by repeated passage. At 0612 hours, she saw movement. 6 figures emerged from the forest to the southeast, exactly where she had predicted. They were moving in a tactical formation, spaced approximately 10 yards apart, their weapons held at low ready. Point man first, not Victor, but a younger soldier she had designated as Echo in her mental catalog. Then Bravo, a heavy-set man who walked with a slight limp from what she suspected was an old injury. Then Charlie and Delta, nearly indistinguishable in their winter gear. Then Foxtrot, the smallest of the group. And finally, Victor Clav. He was walking in the 5th position today, not at the front. Interesting. Perhaps the loss of their scout had made him more cautious. Perhaps he had delegated point duty as a response to the perceived threat. Either way, it complicated her shot. She would have to wait for the formation to shift or accept a less optimal engagement window. Catherine exhaled slowly and adjusted her position by a fraction of an inch. Through her scope, she could see Victor's face. Heavy features, a thick beard streaked with gray, eyes constantly scanning the terrain around him. He was experienced, alert. He understood that somewhere in these mountains, a sniper was waiting for him. He just didn't know where. The patrol continued moving northwest, following the trail toward the valley floor. Catherine tracked them through her scope, her crosshairs drifting from one target to the next as she cataloged positions, evaluated angles, calculated distances. 300 yards, 350, 375, 400. They were entering her engagement zone. The wind had shifted slightly since dawn, now coming from the north-northeast at approximately 16 miles per hour, based on the movement of the snow and the way the soldier's breath vapor drifted. Catherine made a mental adjustment. 2 inches of windage compensation, slightly more than she had planned. The bullet would be in flight for just under half a second. In that time, the wind would push it to the right. She would aim to the left to compensate. 410 yards. Almost time. But Victor was still in the 5th position, partially obscured by the men in front of him. Catherine needed him to step forward, to move into a clear shooting lane, to present a clean target. She needed... The point man stopped. Catherine's breath caught in her throat. Through her scope, she could see Echo raising his hand in a halt signal. The rest of the patrol stopped behind him. weapons coming up, heads swiveling as they searched for whatever had triggered the alert. Echo was looking at something on the ground. A canteen. Catherine had placed it there 2 days ago, half buried in the snow at the edge of the trail. Standard issue American military canteen, the kind that would indicate a hasty retreat. Around it, she had carefully planted false boot prints leading northwest, toward friendly lines, away from a valley. The message was clear. The American sniper had fled. She had dropped her canteen in her haste to escape. She was running. The trap was set. Victor pushed forward through formation, shoving past Charlie and Delta to examine the canteen himself. Catherine watched him kneel beside it, picking it up and turning it over in his gloved hands. He looked up at the surrounding terrain, his eyes sweeping across the granite ridgelines, searching for any sign of movement. He was looking right at her. But at 415 yards, through heavy snowfall, she was invisible, just another gray shape against the gray rock, her ghillie suit breaking up her silhouette until she blended perfectly with the environment. Victor said something to his men. She couldn't hear the words, but she could read his body language. Skepticism. Caution. He didn't fully believe the false trail. He suspected a trick, but his men wanted to believe. They wanted to think the threat was over. They were cold and exhausted and scared, and the evidence in front of them suggested that their enemy had retreated. Victor stood up. He took a step forward, away from his men, following the false boot prints northwest. His back was to the forest. His chest was fully exposed. 415 yards. 16-mile-per-hour wind from the north-northeast. Temperature -12°C. Target stationary, facing northwest, presenting a perfect broadside shot. Catherine's heart rate dropped to 38 beats per minute. Her breathing slowed to an almost imperceptible rhythm. For counts in 7 counts held, 8 counts out. In the pause between exhalation and inhalation, her body became perfectly still. Her finger found the trigger. 2 pounds of pressure. The rifle was set for a 3.5-pound pull. 1 more pound. 1 more breath. The crosshair settled 2 inches left of Victor's sternum, accounting for wind drift. 12 inches low, accounting for bullet drop. 8 inches forward, accounting for the slight movement of his body as he shifted his weight. She was not aiming at where Victor was. She was aiming at where Victor would be in 0.42 seconds. The trigger broke. The rifle bucked against her shoulder with familiar recoil, minimal, controlled, absorbed by her body positioning and the pack beneath the forestock. The sound of the shot was loud in the morning stillness, echoing off the granite walls of the valley like a thunderclap. But the sound didn't matter. By the time Victor heard it, by the time his brain processed the crack of supersonic pressure waves reaching his ears, the bullet would have already completed its journey. Through her scope, Catherine watched the round strike home. The 168-grain projectile entered Victor Klov's chest 2 inches right of his sternum, traveling at approximately 2,400 feet per second after accounting for distance decay. At that velocity, the boat tail hollow point expanded on impact, transferring its kinetic energy into the soft tissue of his thoracic cavity with devastating efficiency. The bullet tore through his right lung, severed his pulmonary artery, and exited through his back in a spray of crimson that stained the snow behind him. Victor's body jerked once, a violent involuntary spasm, and then he collapsed. He was dead before he hit the ground. Or rather, he would be dead within 90 seconds, his brain still firing neurons in a dying cascade of electrical activity, even as his heart stopped pumping blood. But functionally, operationally, tactically, he was dead. 1 shot, 1 kill. The reaction of his men was immediate and chaotic. Echo dropped flat, his face pressed into the snow, hands covering his head as if that would protect him from a sniper round. Bravo spun in a full circle, his rifle raised, searching wildly for a target he couldn't see. Charlie and Delta collided with each other as they both tried to take cover behind the same tree. Foxtrot simply froze, standing motionless in the middle of the trail, his weapon dangling forgotten at his side. None of them knew where the shot had come from. They had heard the echo, but the sound had bounced off multiple rock faces, creating a confusing wash of noise that gave no indication of direction. They were exposed in the open, for 100 yards from any effective cover, with a sniper somewhere in the mountains above them. They were helpless. Catherine worked the bolt of her rifle. The spent brass casing ejected to her right, landing in the snow with a soft clink. She chambered a fresh round. 23 remaining, and settled her crosshairs on Bravo. She could kill him now. Then Charlie. Then Delta. She could eliminate the entire patrol in perhaps 8 seconds if she worked fast enough, before any of them found cover. For more rounds, for more bodies, and Victor's unit would be effectively destroyed. Her finger touched the trigger. And then she stopped. One shot. That was the mission. One shot to break their morale, to demonstrate that nowhere in this valley was safe, to prove that their enemy was still here, still watching, still capable of killing any of them at any time. The psychological impact of a single perfect kill was worth 1,000 bullets sprayed in panic. Besides, she only had 23 rounds left. She needed to conserve ammunition for the days ahead. Catherine pulled her eye away from the scope and began the process of extraction. Slowly, impossibly slowly, despite every instinct screaming at her to move fast, she inched backward out of her firing position. The snow would cover her tracks within minutes. The sound of the shot had already faded into echoes. By the time Victor's men regained enough composure to search for her, she would be a ghost. She crawled 40 yards before she rose to a crouch, then another 100 before she began walking. Behind her, she could hear distant shouting. Victor's men finally finding their voices, screaming orders and counterorders as they tried to organize a response to an enemy they couldn't see. Let them scream. Let them search. They would find nothing but wind and snow and a single spent brass casing buried in the ice. Catherine walked for 3 hours, looping north and then west, putting multiple ridgelines between herself and the valley before she allowed herself to stop. She found a sheltered depression between 2 fallen pine trees, their branches creating a natural blind, and she settled in to wait. The next phase would require patience. Over the following days, Catherine watched from various observation posts as Victor's men fell apart. Without their sergeant's leadership, command authority fragmented among the remaining soldiers. Bravo tried to take charge, but he lacked Victor's experience, his tactical instinct, his ability to read terrain. The patrol patterns became erratic, unpredictable in the worst possible way, not because they were adapting to threat, but because they had lost cohesion. They stopped sending scouts. They stopped following their training. They huddled in their camp for miles to the southeast, and they waited for salvation that would eventually come from higher command. Catherine used the time productively. She moved between 5 different observation posts, never staying in one location for more than 4 hours. She watched the enemy camp through her binoculars, 700 yards, too far for a reliable shot with her equipment, but close enough to monitor their activities. She counted their supplies. She noted their guard rotations. She cataloged every weakness, every vulnerability, every exploitable pattern. On the second day after the kill, she noticed something that made her pause. One of the soldiers, the smallest one, Foxtrot, was sitting apart from the others at the edge of the camp. He was holding something in his hands, staring at it with an expression Catherine couldn't identify at this distance. After several minutes, another soldier approached him and put a hand on his shoulder. Foxtrot didn't look up. He was mourning. Catherine lowered her binoculars and sat back against the rock face behind her. The revelation shouldn't have affected her. She had killed 47 people before Victor Klav, and she had learned long ago that emotional detachment was essential for survival. You couldn't think of the enemy as human. You couldn't wonder about their families, their hopes, their fears, the people who would grieve for them when they were gone. They were targets, threats, problems requiring solutions. That was the mantra, the psychological armor. The wall she had built between Catherine Wade the person and Frost the weapon. But sometimes, in moments like this, cracks appeared in the wall. She thought about her own isolation. 14 months in these mountains, first with a spotter, and then alone after Sergeant Reyes took shrapnel to his leg during their 3rd month of deployment. 14 months without physical contact with another human being except through the scope of her rifle. 14 months of silence and cold and the constant, grinding weight of kills accumulating in her memory, like stones dropped into a well. 48 now, counting Victor. She remembered each of them. Not their names. She rarely knew their names, but their faces. The moment of recognition in their eyes when they understood, too late, that death had found them. The way their bodies crumpled, the marionette strings cut, the life draining out of them in seconds. She remembered the first one. A young man, barely older than she had been at the time, standing guard outside a checkpoint in a desert city that seemed impossibly far away now. 320 yards. Her first confirmed kill. Her instructor had slapped her on the shoulder and said, "Good shot," and she had felt nothing except the strange satisfaction of a technical challenge overcome. When had the numbness started to crack? Maybe it was the isolation. Maybe it was the cold. Maybe it was the fact that she hadn't received mail from home in 3 months, and for all she knew, her father had died in his sleep, and no one had thought to tell her. Maybe it was a slow accumulation of faces in her memory, stacking up like cordwood until the weight of them became impossible to ignore. Or maybe it was just Victor Clav, falling dead into the snow while his men screamed and panicked and mourned. Catherine shook her head and raised her binoculars again. Emotion was a luxury she couldn't afford. She had a mission to complete, enemy combatants to neutralize, a sector to deny to hostile forces until friendly units could reinforce her position, whenever that might be. She was a weapon. Weapons didn't grieve. Weapons didn't wonder. The third day brought salvation for Victor's men, if not for Victor himself. At approximately 1,400 hours, Catherine heard the distinctive thrum of a helicopter approaching from the southeast. She tracked it through her binoculars as it descended toward the enemy camp, a transport helicopter, military configuration, capable of carrying perhaps a dozen soldiers plus crew. It touched down in a clearing beyond the tree line, rotors kicking up clouds of snow that obscured the camp from her view. When the snow settled, she saw the remaining soldiers loading Victor's body, wrapped in a dark tarpaulin, into the aircraft's cargo bay. They worked quickly, efficiently, with the desperate energy of men who wanted nothing more than to leave this place behind. 7 survivors. Foxtrot, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, and 3 others she hadn't assigned designations to. They climbed aboard the helicopter one by one, their weapons slung, their heads bowed. The aircraft lifted off, banked to the southeast, and disappeared over the ridgeline. They were gone. The valley was hers. Catherine waited another 2 hours before moving. Patience had kept her alive this long, and she was about to abandon it now. The helicopter might return. There might be additional units in the area. The extraction might have been faint, designed to draw her out of cover. But nothing moved. No sound except the wind. No sign of hostile presence anywhere within visual range. At 1,630 hours, she began the careful descent toward the abandoned enemy camp. The camp was a mess of abandoned equipment and scattered supplies. Victor's men had left in a hurry, taking only what they could carry and leaving everything else behind. Catherine moved through the debris with practiced caution, checking corners, clearing tents, ensuring that no surprises waited for her in the deepening shadows. She found ration packs, enough food to sustain her for another 2 weeks. She found spare ammunition for weapons she couldn't use, but might be able to trade or cache for future operations. She found medical supplies, thermal gear, a working radio that she could potentially repair and use to contact friendly forces. And she found a photograph. It was lying in the snow near the entrance to the largest tent, Victor's tent, she assumed. A small rectangle of glossy paper, slightly crumpled, showing signs of having been handled many times. Catherine picked it up and brushed the ice crystals from its surface. A woman smiled at the camera. She was perhaps 35, with dark hair and eyes that crinkled at the corners in genuine happiness. Beside her stood 2 children, a boy of maybe 8, serious face and formal in a suit that looked too big for him, and a girl perhaps 5, her arm wrapped around her mother's leg, half hiding from the camera. Behind them was a house, blue paint, white trim, a garden in full summer bloom. Victor's family. Catherine stared at the photograph for a long time. She didn't know how long. Time had become elastic, stretching and compressing in ways she couldn't track. The wind picked up, driving snow against her face, and still she stared at the woman and the children and the blue house. She had destroyed this. Not the house, not the garden, but the family. She had put a bullet through Victor Clav's chest and ended his existence. And somewhere far from here, a woman was about to receive news that would shatter her world. A boy would grow up without a father. A girl would forget what he looked like because of her. Because of one 168 grain round manufactured at the Lake City Army ammunition plant, traveling at 2,400 feet per second through the frozen morning air. Catherine's hand trembled Just for a moment. Just a tiny vibration in her fingers that she suppressed immediately, the way she suppressed everything that threatened to compromise her effectiveness. She should drop the photograph, leave it in the snow, let it be buried and forgotten, just like Victor Claw's body would be buried and forgotten in whatever grave awaited him in his homeland. Instead, she put it in her pocket. She couldn't explain why. She didn't try. The reasons were buried too deep for conscious examination, hidden in the same place where she kept the faces of 48 kills and the silence of 14 months and the growing, gnawing certainty that something essential had broken inside her somewhere along the way. She was still functional, still operational, still capable of completing her mission and eliminating threats and walking north toward whatever came next. But she was not whole. She had never been particularly religious. Her father had raised her with practical skepticism that left no room for faith or metaphysics. But in that moment, standing in the abandoned enemy camp with a dead man's family photograph in her pocket, she found herself envying the snow. The snow covered everything. It buried the blood and the bodies and the evidence of violence beneath a layer of pristine white. It forgot. It moved on. It had no memory, no conscience, no weight of accumulated actions pressing down on it year after year. Catherine envied that. She envied it with a ferocity that surprised her, a desperate longing to be clean and empty and free of the 48 faces that haunted her whenever she closed her eyes. But she was not snow. She was flesh and blood and memory and conscience. She was cursed with the weight of choices made and bullets fired and lives ended. She would carry this, would bear it, would function despite it, for however many years remained to her, and she would keep carrying it north, one step at a time, toward the next mission. The sun had set by the time Catherine finished searching the camp. The temperature had dropped to minus 18 Celsius, and the wind had picked up to perhaps 25 miles per hour, dangerous conditions for anyone caught without shelter. She chose the largest tent for the night, not out of sentimentality or some morbid desire to occupy Victor's space, but because it was the most structurally sound and offered the best protection from the elements. She spread out her sleeping gear on the frozen ground, ate 2 of the enemy ration packs she had salvaged, and prepared for another night of semi-conscious rest. But sleep, even the fractured, watchful version she had grown accustomed to, would not come. Instead, she lay in the darkness and thought about the mathematics of her existence. 1 bullet, 43 cents worth of materials, brass, lead, copper, and powder. Perhaps 8 seconds of total engagement time, from trigger pull to target collapse. And with that minimal investment of resources and time, she had neutralized an entire enemy unit. 7 survivors extracted by helicopter. 1 sector denied to hostile forces. 1 strategic objective achieved. The military called this economy of force. Maximum effect from minimum expenditure. It was doctrine, strategy, the fundamental principle of asymmetric warfare. A single well-trained sniper could shape the battlefield in ways that 100 conventional soldiers could not. Catherine was very good at economy of force. But there was another kind of mathematics, one that the training manuals didn't discuss. The accumulating cost of each trigger pull. The weight that gathered in the soul, if she even had a soul anymore, with every face added to the collection. 48 now. The first 10 had been easy. Targets at distance, barely recognizable as human through scope, falling and lying still without drama or emotion. The next 10 had been harder, as the novelty wore off and the reality began to settle in. The 10 after that, she had started to notice the patterns, the way bodies fell, the expressions on faces, the brief moments of recognition before consciousness ended. By kill number 30, she had stopped feeling anything at all. The numbness had descended like a blessing, a protective fog that allowed her to function without the distraction of emotion. She had welcomed it, cultivated it, relied on it. Now, somewhere in the darkness of a dead man's tent, she realized the numbness was cracking. She took out Victor's photograph and looked at it again. The chemical light stick she had cracked cast just enough illumination to see the faces. The woman, the children, the blue house. A summer day captured in glossy paper. A moment of happiness that existed in some other timeline, some parallel universe, where Victor Claw had never joined the military and Catherine Wade had never picked up a rifle. Why had she kept this? What possible purpose did it serve? She couldn't answer. The reasons, if there were reasons, existed below the level of conscious thought, in the same dark territory where instinct and intuition and basic survival programming resided. Something in her had recognized this photograph as important. Something in her had refused to let it go. Maybe it was evidence. Proof that the enemy were human beings with families and hopes and ordinary lives that had been interrupted by war. Proof that her kills were not abstract statistics, but concrete destructions of real people who had mattered to someone. Maybe it was penance. A reminder of what she had done, what she was still doing, what she would continue to do until the war ended, or she did. A weight she had chosen to carry, because some part of her still believed in accountability. Or maybe, and this was a thought she kept circling back to, the one she couldn't quite accept, maybe it was humanity, the last fragment of herself that still felt, still grieved, still recognized the cost of what she had become, the part that the training and the isolation and the 48 kills had not yet managed to destroy. She didn't know. She might never know. Dawn came gray and cold, filtering to the tent fabric in pale washes of light. Catherine had not slept. She had spent the night in the half-aware state that passed for rest, her mind processing, planning, preparing for the next phase of her mission. She rose at 0530, ate a breakfast of enemy rations, and began the systematic destruction of the camp. The tents burned first. She soaked them with accelerant she found among the supplies and set them alight with a chemical fire starter, watching the flames consume the fabric in hungry orange tongues. Then the equipment. She smashed the radios, disabled the weapons she couldn't carry, scattered the ammunition in the snow where it would be buried and forgotten. By 0700, nothing remained of the enemy camp except ash and debris and the memory of men who had thought they could survive in her valley. They had been wrong. Catherine shouldered her pack and checked her rifle one final time. Bore clean, action smooth. 17 rounds remaining after the one she had fired at Victor. She had decided to keep 7 in reserve, cached in a secondary location, in case she needed to return to the sector. 10 rounds for the next mission. Whatever that turned out to be, she began walking north. The terrain shifted gradually as she moved, the granite ridgelines giving way to denser forest, the snow deepening until it reached her mid-thighs in places. Progress was slow, perhaps 2 miles per hour in the difficult conditions, but she had learned patience over 14 months of lone operation. Speed was less important than sustainability. She could walk for days if necessary, rationing her energy, conserving her strength, arriving at her destination ready to fight. As she walked, she thought about the life she had left behind. Montana, the ranch, her father's silence and her mother's absence, dead when Catherine was 6, a car accident on an icy road that her father never discussed. She thought about the deer blinds and the early morning hunts and the way the mountains looked at sunrise, painted in shades of pink and gold that seemed too beautiful for a world that contained so much violence. She wondered if she would ever see those mountains again. The probability was low. 14 months in hostile territory, 48 kills, countless near misses, and close calls that could have ended her existence at any moment. The odds accumulated against her with every passing day. Sooner or later, a bullet would find her, a mortar round, a trap she didn't see in time. Something would end her, and she would join the collection of bodies she had created. Another statistic in a war that would be forgotten within a generation. That was the mathematics of her situation. Cold and implacable and beyond her control. What she could control was how she spent the time remaining, whether she used it well, whether the bullet she fired achieved something meaningful beyond the simple extinction of individual lives. Victor Claw's death had achieved something meaningful. It had neutralized an enemy unit, denied hostile forces access to a strategic sector, protected friendly operations in ways that would never be recorded in any after-action report. 1 bullet, 43 cents, and 7 soldiers evacuated in terror, their mission abandoned, their confidence shattered. That was economy of force. That was what she was for. The photograph pressed against her chest, tucked into the inner pocket of her parka, where she had placed it the night before. She could feel its weight, not physical, not really, but present nonetheless. A constant reminder of the cost. She would carry it, would bear it, would function despite it. That was all she could do. The forest thinned as Catherine approached the northern ridgeline, opening onto a vast expanse of white that stretched toward distant mountains she had never explored. Somewhere beyond those peaks lay friendly territory, supply lines, reinforcements, the possibility of extraction and debrief, and a return to something resembling normal life. But that was 40 miles away. Several days of hard travel through contested terrain, and between here and there, new missions waited. New enemies, new bullets to fire, and new faces to add to the collection. She stopped at the edge of the tree line and turned to look back at the valley behind her. The smoke from the burning camp had dissipated hours ago, scattered by the wind until nothing remained to mark where Victor Claw's men had made their stand. The snow was falling again, fresh powder covering the blood and the footprints and the evidence of violence. By nightfall, the valley would look pristine and untouched, as if no human being had ever passed through it. The snow would forget. Catherine would not. She turned north again and began walking, one foot in front of the other, one step at a time, the rifle on her back and the photograph in her pocket, and the weight of 48 kills pressing down on her shoulders like a physical burden. She was still a weapon, still functional, still capable of completing whatever mission came next. But she was also something else now, something that had cracked open at night, in a dead man's tent, while holding a photograph of a family she had destroyed. Something that envied the snow and feared the memories and carried the weight of conscience despite every effort to shed it. She was human. She had almost forgotten. The sun rose higher as she walked, painting the eastern sky in shades of pale gold and rose. It was beautiful in the stark and indifferent way of wilderness, and Catherine found herself pausing to watch it. The colors reminded her of Montana, of mornings in the deer blind with her father, of a time before any of this had begun. She would carry those memories too, would bear them alongside the faces and the photograph and the weight of all her choices, would function despite it all, because that was what she had been trained to do, and because stopping was not an option. Not yet. Not while the war continued. Not while missions remained. Not while her rifle still held ammunition, and her body still drew breath, and her mind still calculated distances and windage, and the precise spot where a bullet needed to strike to end a life. She was Catherine Wade, call sign Frost. 48 confirmed kills, 14 months of lone operation, one photograph she couldn't explain. And somewhere ahead, waiting in the snow and the silence and the cold, the next mission was calling. She answered, one step at a time. She walked north into the white. The forest swallowed her. The snow covered her tracks. And within an hour, it was as if she had never been there at all. Just another ghost in a landscape full of ghosts, moving through the wilderness toward whatever came next. The photograph stayed in her pocket. The weight stayed in her soul. And the war, the endless, grinding, dehumanizing war, continued on. But for one moment, standing at the edge of the tree line with the sunrise painting the sky, Catherine had allowed herself to feel something. Grief, perhaps, or guilt, or the terrible, undeniable knowledge that she had become exactly what the military had designed her to be, and that becoming had cost her something irreplaceable. She would not break. She would not stop. But she would remember. And in the end, perhaps that was the only rebellion left to her, the refusal to forget, to let the snow bury everything, to become as cold and indifferent as the mountains themselves. She was still human. That would have to be enough. The North waited. Catherine Wade walked on.